Good morning, all. Let's go ahead and take our seats so we can get started here. Thank you. My name is Bill Murray. I'm the President and CEO of the Medical Device Innovation Consortium. Very excited today. This is a big day for MDIC. Our annual public forum is an opportunity to communicate all of the great work that our total ecosystem collaborators are doing, and today I think you'll get a sense for, through the morning and afternoon program, a good understanding of the work we're doing in collaboration with stakeholders throughout the ecosystem. A couple housekeeping items before we get started. First, the restrooms are out. The gentleman's is immediately to the left, and then the ladies is across the hall and to the right. The Pew has asked that if you need to step out to take a call, to go down one floor, because they have offices immediately outside here, and so the noise does tend to carry into the office area. So if you could support that, that would be great. And other than that, I think we have coffee and water and what have you in the back of the room, and feel free to get it as you desire. So I'm very pleased with the lineup that we have today. We're very excited by all of the people that will be presenting, but in particular, our first keynote speaker is a person of that's obviously got a very important role today, and potentially an even bigger role coming up, and that is Dr. Robert Califf, who is currently the Deputy Commissioner of Medical Products and Tobacco at FDA, and recently announced his nomination to be the Commissioner for FDA. So we're very excited for Dr. Califf, and very excited that he is here today to make a few remarks. I can assure you that the confirmation hearings will probably be more challenging than the questions you get from our audience today. But just a wonderful opportunity, and I've had Dr. Califf has been in his position since February of this year, and I will tell you that I have been impressed with his command and understanding. Obviously, he's an expert in clinical trials and clinical research, and has a very strong grasp on medical devices, so we're very pleased to have him here. Just before we start, I would like to say that MDIC, a little bit about MDIC, and just starting with, this was a report that was published earlier this month for the FDA Science Review Board, and it talked about extramural collaborations, and it highlights in particular, as an example, the importance that public-private partnerships have, and the example that was highlighted in the executive summary was the Medical Device Innovation Consortium. So we're very pleased about the recognition that we received from the work we're doing, and we're now coming up on 3 years as an organization. It'll be 3 years in December. I joined just over 2 years ago as we started to kind of get the organization built and some support and funding, and we'll talk about more of that as we go through the day today. Just briefly, MDIC, we are a public-private partnership. We are uniquely focused on regulatory science for medical device ecosystem, and so that is what separates us from many of the other public-private partnerships that are out there. Our public-private partnership is made up of members from industry, from government, FDA, CMS, and NIH, as well as nonprofit organizations, including the Pew Charitable Trust, where we are today. So we're very pleased with the broad participation within the ecosystem of our work. You're going to hear from a number of people during this first panel regarding the creation of MDIC and the importance of regulatory science. So I'm going to let more of that kind of come out during the morning session. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Califf, who is going to speak to you about the importance of regulatory science and some of his views and perspectives on public-private partnerships. So Dr. Califf?
Thanks, Bill. It's great to be here with y'all today. And especially excited about this partnership, which I've had a chance to sort of see from the beginning, and it's really got legs now, as I think the rest of the day will show. First of all, thanks for the nice introduction, and I do want to make it clear I'm just nominated for this position, and I'm pretty excited about the chance to take on the job if given the opportunity by the Senate, but it is up to the Senate. And I'm currently in the job as a Deputy Commissioner, as you mentioned, for medical products and tobacco, and that's certainly quite a large span of activities to try to get your arms around, and that's really the perspective that I'll speak from today. I think a lot of you know from my history that I'm very aware and insistent that, in fact, all medical products exist in what you've correctly termed an ecosystem. That is, there's not one dominant player. There are many elements of the team. Team members have a role to play. What's really changed, I think, in the last decade, mostly due to all the changes in our society and social media, is that the distinctions and the boundaries across the teams have gotten blurred. And we're all, I think, in a learning phase right now about how to deal with that, and I think this is a major part of the activity of MDIC as it relates to the FDA in particular. I do want to stress, right from the beginning that you can't be in the job at FDA for more than a day without being hyper aware of the fact that there's really sort of a sacred key bedrock element of the FDA, which is the review of medical products and the ongoing surveillance for safety and appropriate use. And those elements have to be really walled off and kept separate. I think everybody understands that that's something the American public very much depends on. And so it does lead to some complexity in the kinds of things you're talking about today, where we want to advance the science, which is very much dependent on many other team players besides FDA. On the other hand, when it comes to medical product review, that has to be kept separate, has to be nonpartisan and unbiased. And I think the American public is very aware of that. We're certainly aware of it. And it's a fair challenge to work out all the rules that need to exist for public-private partnerships to thrive. So that's the first point I wanted to make. But as we look into this deeper, we can see the many constituents who are really team members. Obviously the industry, which used to be walled off from all the other elements, but now we have academia now very much going into integrated health systems, which have a major say in development of all sorts of medical products and increasing power because they're aggregating into very large units. The system I came from at Duke is relatively small at about $3 billion in revenue per year. But if you just look at the region we're in right now, Hopkins, MedStar, Inova, they're each, I think, over $9 billion in revenue. These are major elements who have become more multifaceted. They all have an academic component in the middle, which is mixing the mission of discovery, innovation, evaluation, creativity, and business, the business of healthcare delivery. And so we are mixing it up. But the great advance that I think is going to be the most important part of the system, which I've had a lot of fun participating in over the last decade, is the emergence, strangely enough, of the patient and the consumer as key players on the team. When I came along in the late 70s in medical school, we were very devoted to patient care, but we thought of patients as recipients of our tremendous wisdom that we had as doctors. That was sort of how you were trained. And growing up developing treatments for conditions like heart attack and heart failure, the patients really came in at the end of the day as people who would be given prescriptions or have devices implanted by clinicians. But that's all changed, and I think it's the greatest thing that's happened to the system. And when you look back on it now, sort of like a lot of things historically, you'd say, why would anyone want to develop a device for a condition that affects people without directly involving the people with the condition from the very beginning? And I've said this before, but I was not aware of the degree to which Jeff's team at CDRH had taken this to heart and really pushing the industry. And, you know, I was in this camp a couple of years ago being a little bit anxious about this because it's letting the people affected inside the tent can feel a little scary because you reveal sometimes how little you actually know and how much is still exploratory. But CDRH, I think, has done a phenomenal job of pushing all the other team members to say, let's not just think about patient preferences, which is a hot topic right now, but if you're going to develop a device and you want to come to the FDA, show up with people who are affected by the condition. And as we think about the major advantages of social media, there's certainly some interesting twists and disadvantages at times and things that we still have to understand. But we're now rapidly moving from a situation where we had to depend on representatives of people with conditions to the people themselves, because it used to be there was no way to contact everybody with a condition, but almost everyone now has a cell phone. The majority are smartphones, and the capacity of those to provide interactive information is growing rapidly. So it's a new day. We're all on the team. We all have roles, and we're still trying to understand these roles better. And, you know, I applaud the people that have come to join at the FDA for dealing with this complexity where we've got to keep the sanctity of product review while at the same time engaging in the scientific and clinical worlds to make things better. So a little bit now about the priorities and how these fit into partnerships in the broader scientific community. My mantra on this has not changed since I've come to the FDA. I'm feeling pretty good that what people had told me before I came really were the key scientific issues. They really cut across all the centers, not just devices that we all need to be aware of and thinking about. The first is the measurement of outcomes. And it's actually a lot more complicated than I used to think it was. I'm someone who's designed and done a lot of clinical trials and outcome studies. But if we begin with biomarkers, something that we measure as a biological measurement, and then think about all the multiple uses of biomarkers, the criteria for when a biomarker can be used as a surrogate in decision-making about whether a medical product should be allowed on the market, or whether a clinician should follow a patient using that marker, something that's in practice very important. And then we go to patient-reported outcomes, and outcomes now derived from things that people carry on their bodies, the watches that measure heart rate and blood pressure, and these are going to advance very rapidly, and we know that. And then the good old-fashioned clinical outcomes, which, I personally still very much believe that the majority of people, when it comes down to it, only want to have their insurance company or themselves spend money if the product makes them feel better, live longer, or avoid other negative consequences in life. So measuring what actually happens to people probably is going to be more important in the future, not less. But, of course, that's also changing because we used to depend on people showing up at a clinic or a hospital before we could ask them what was going on or measure what happened to them. Now they can just get on the phone, as they all do every morning, and send in the information. But we've got to learn more about how to do that. So this whole spectrum is an enormous body of work. It's old in a sense, but the modern interpretation in this new era of sort of what I think of as bilateral revolutions, one in biological sciences and engineering, and the other in just the general field of information, it's all got to be recast, and we need to do that together to come up with the right rules of the road so that we can employ all this knowledge to the benefit of people. Now then, the second part of this to me is the evidence generation system, and if you don't believe we need improvements in the evidence generation system, I would just ask that you look at headlines in the news about technology in the last week. The problem, in my view, is not that people aren't trying hard and they're not creative. We have a national evidence generation system which is not fit for purpose. And it's not any individual's fault. It's a group own goal, if you will, like in soccer. We've got amazing technology to generate evidence now, but we haven't figured out how to employ it in the most effective way. I think about this in segments. And again, this is really not device-specific, but it's very pertinent to devices. The first is what I would call human phenotyping. That's kind of a fancy word to say, what does a person look like? How do you measure how a person's doing, either in the normal state? Defining normal, by the way, is a whole endeavor that we have to redo now that we can measure so much. Or with a particular condition that we're concerned about. And you're all aware that in many diseases, it's sort of started with cancer, but we're now segmenting diseases into multiple components by our ability to measure biological systems and outcomes. So we used to think of cancer by a sort of organ type, and now we know pathways are a better way to characterize cancer. But the same thing is happening with heart failure and diabetes and coronary disease, arthritis, you name it. So this phenotyping effort is a big deal. We all need to work on it. But then we get into clinical trials, and clinical trials is my great scientific love. I think a lot of people know that. I've spent my career trying to argue for appropriate design of clinical trials to get the right answers. In many cases, to me, that means much simplification. In some cases, it actually means more complexity. But right now, more than 85% of major decisions made by clinicians based on clinical practice guidelines do not have high-quality evidence. And, my field of cardiology, I think, is the best. We've had sort of a contest among fields, but it's not very good to say you're best in the worst league you can imagine, where 85% of the time you haven't really generated the evidence that you need. And, of course, the great thing is now we know that we can do it because almost every American has an electronic health record. We almost all have personal devices. What used to hold us back, which was just getting access to the information, is no longer the problem. We really have to work together to create a system so that those who develop the best medical products win the contest and people know what's best so that doctors, patients, and consumers keep having to be reminded a large part of the FDA deals with consumers, not patients, so they can make good choices. And then the third element, which is, in my view, very related to the clinical trials, is what people have called real-world data. And when you have everyone with an electronic health record and many very high-quality registries which have been developed because of the pressure on clinicians to demonstrate quality in what they do, you really have the substrate to have, like many things in life, a continuous measurement system, and then employ randomization, the randomized trial, when it's appropriate. And before I came, I learned a lot from Silicon Valley and work that I was doing, and I was unaware until a few years ago that almost everything that Google and Facebook do that's important, they employ randomization to figure out the best way to do it. So when you log on to Google, you're participating in randomized trials. And if it's good enough for selling things on a computer system, it ought to be good enough to determine what your best medical products are and what the best health is. So I don't see these elements as totally dissociated from each other. I think randomization embedded into electronic records and registries is critical. Then patient-centeredness itself is a science that cuts across all of the Office of Medical Products and tobacco. And there's a lot of intuitiveness to it. It feels right, but the science of how to do things right and make sure we have the right samples. If we're going to go directly to people to understand what their problems are and how they're doing, we better make sure we get a good sample when we do that, or the whole population. And there are many issues involved in that we need to continue to work out. When we ask questions, we better make sure people understand the questions that we're asking so the answers are useful. Embedded in all this, of course, is ethics, which is not necessarily a science. And ethics has many elements, but as we're evolving into this learning health system, there are a lot of questions that come up that we need to understand what people think is right, and we need to tailor the system to help people. I would call your attention to the new version of the Common Rule, which came out for final public comment just a few weeks ago. It's a little daunting. It's 595 pages, I think. But remember, this is the rule book by which all of our human studies are done in the United States. And it's going to be very profound in terms of where it's taking us in terms of the involvement of patients and consumers in the system of generating evidence. Then the final thing to mention is globalization, which I knew about it at the FDA, but now that I've had a chance to look at it from the inside, there are just a huge set of issues that we have to deal with. It's obviously, I was almost didn't go down and get on the metro when I saw the discussions of the Pope, the head of China, the President, and Putin all being at the UN at the same time, which is pretty remarkable. But, we live in a world where many of the great discoveries and ideas are not going to come directly from the U.S., yet we have a special responsibility because we are the fountain of the most creative ideas, and that hasn't changed. It's very palpable when you're in the FDA to see how you're looked at by people in the rest of the world. We are the gold standard. But when it comes to things like supply lines and where products are produced and how they come together to make something that's useful, there's a lot to learn about how to most scientifically deal with that. So that's sort of a summary of the things that I think are amenable to public-private partnerships. To conclude again, none of these issues are unique to the FDA, but all of them are pertinent to all aspects of the FDA. We want to work with you to figure out what to do, but then also keep that element. We have to have the judgment capability that's independent and not amenable to influence by these partnerships. So thanks, and I think I can take a couple of questions if people have any they want to ask.
In your experience, Rob, have you seen any other public-private partnerships that are good sort of role models for what we're trying to do?
Bill, I think I'm a little biased because I've been, when I was on the other side of the fence, that was one of the main things that I worked on. So, CTTI, which is work I regard as sort of a parallel to this, I think has been very effective in pushing along these ideas, and that's actually what got me involved more with the patient groups. There was a great meeting at CTTI where I was expressing anxiety about, what if we do something wrong when we're involving the world of patients, and a patient advocate got up and said, "You better wake up," and it got me there. But, as you know, there are many other non-medical elements of our society where public-private partnerships are making a huge difference, and I think as we develop our style at the FDA, we need to study the successful ones and also learn from the ones that don't work, because in my experience, there's nothing worse than a public-private partnership that gets nothing done. It's a drain of time and energy. Yes.
The population modeling, phenotype kind of things that you were talking about, how is the communication between the FDA and NIH, where all this research is being funded, where I know the computational biologists are looking for how can they be more creditable, and for getting to the point where you could conceivably have libraries of reusable stuff, all that has to be captured in the basic science models first. And if there's no connection between what the FDA and the drug industry is going to need and what is being funded into bioimaging, bioengineering modeling, we're going to waste a whole lot of stuff.
I'm really glad you asked that because it was one of the things I wanted to comment on. There's a thing called the FDA-NIH Joint Leadership Council, or if you're at the NIH, you call it the NIH-FDA Joint Leadership Council, and we meet every 6 months, but in between there are committees that work, and the topics that I went through are what we're entirely focused on. And I would say right now the communication, just as an example, the leadership of NIH got on a bus and came to the FDA last week for a 3-hour meeting to talk about these things. So, the discussion is at a fever pitch right now. And part of it is, just to quickly mention this, the basic science is critical. That's the NIH's mission. It's not the FDA's mission, although we do some basic science when it has regulatory implications. But what's also happening is that with the human genome, the basic science is moving into people. And the time between discovery and translation is getting very short. So there's a lot of enthusiasm at NIH to work with FDA, and we're reciprocating. So, but keep the pressure on about that because it's hard work and they're big places. Keep asking. Okay.
And I don't suppose they get to vote for who's going to be the commissioner.
No, you don't.
One question. You mentioned how the review process and the reviewers need to be walled off. The danger in that, of course, is insularity and the development of a bunker mentality. But on the other hand, we have many scientists in many fields at FDA who interact. One way is through these public-private partnerships. How do you see that as a way of getting some, maybe welcome penetration of something that could be walled off?
So I think you got in a sense that I don't think anyone yet has come up with a perfect formula for looking at the FDA of the future. And that's a lot of what, as you know, Congress is talking about, and certainly the President also very interested in this because he's, as one other thing to mention, the Precision Medicine Initiative, which is the President's initiative, is really meant to drive the technology of multidimensional, enormous data sets that the FDA is going to need to deal with. And you can't deal with that from a walled-off environment. So we've got work to do to figure out how to do this right. And people will have to watch, and I'm sure we'll make some mistakes along the way. But we've got to preserve that one part while also having our scientists be keeping up with a part of science which is just exploding right now. I was at a meeting day before yesterday looking at whole genome sequencing and how we're going to deal with it. If you think about 3 billion base pairs in every individual, being submitted as part of applications, it's going to be a different world. So I wish I had a crisp answer, but it's going to take work. Yes.
Know what we're doing in medicine is successful. How do you measure the outcomes and success of CDRH and FDA, both in their activities in general and the public-private partnerships in particular?
Well, I can speak a little bit to CDRH, and Jeff may have some other things to say, but, they're sort of, I think they're two, they're really, as I'm looking at it on the website, there are 3 missions at FDA: protect the public, stimulate innovation, and the third part is dealing with information. We have a role in making sure that the information that comes out is as good as it can be. All these are big challenges, but certainly one core measurement at FDA is very publicly available, which is review times and how well the routine business is getting done. I think the more stimulating innovation and making the right decisions is much more difficult, and I'm not really prepared to comment on that right now, but it's certainly an area where we're going to have a lot of dialogue, because getting that right is inevitably a matter of opinion. Yes?
Yeah, thank you. You've covered so much. It's really helpful. On patient-centeredness, you said there are many issues involved, and there's a lot that we have to work out. We have to make sure the answers are useful. And I'm wondering how you think public-private partnerships can help on that front, if there are examples you could share. What do you want to see the successes look like in the reign of the next commissioner?
Well, I can't address the reign of the next commissioner because I may not be the next commissioner. That's up to the U.S. Senate. But I can certainly talk from my role as deputy commissioner that I think there's sort of two elements to this from the FDA's perspective. One is partnerships where the FDA is integral, because we need to hear directly from patients, not just at meetings about individual products, but more about their concerns about their diseases and their problems. So if you look at what, it's been fun for me, the patchwork between CDRH and then the drug side. CDRH is focused a lot more on preferences. The drug side is focused more on meetings where people come in and talk about their diseases and problems. But these really fit together quite nicely. So we need to hear from people independently of their concerns and interest in a specific product, and that's a key issue for FDA. But then, I was up at the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation. It's okay for me to say this, I have permission. My mom has multiple myeloma, and she's benefited from 4 consecutive drugs that came on the market just as she became refractory to the previous drug regimen. And when you look at what they've done, bringing in patients, industry, having the patients really drive the quality measures and recruit into the clinical trials and demanding that the clinical trials address the questions that the patients are interested in, there's an ecosystem which I think is working, and I personally benefited from it. So none of that is controlled by the FDA. We're just people at the table, cheering them on and enjoying getting high-quality applications with good data, because the patients are driving the need for good data, and they're looking carefully at what companies are doing. That, to me, is sort of the ultimate.
Thank you very much for your comments. It's great. I have a question regarding regulatory harmonization across the planet, actually, because we're all looking at cost and effectiveness of different technologies, and costs are driven to a large extent by the different requirements of the different countries. Do you have any thoughts on where you think that might go in the future?
Well, I can say just a quick word about regulatory harmonization. I can't really talk about costs at this point. That's not the FDA's primary role, but I'm scheduled to be in London next week meeting with the EMA, and there's certainly a great need for transparent, good working relationships between, particularly as it comes to the operational aspects of evidence generation. And EMA and FDA have a lot in common and still a good bit of work to do. I wouldn't argue that the decisions need to all be the same, because the decisions about the risk-benefit trade-offs are dependent on culture. And so what might be okay in one society might not be okay in another. But when companies and patients are having to do different things in the studies they do, it runs up expense, and to the extent that that's redundant and unnecessary, we need to cut it out. Many of you also know I had the real joy of helping to start up a medical school in Singapore. I'm very aware of the regulatory needs in Asia. I keep reminding people that 2/3 of the world's population lives in Asia, and that's going to be a lot of work to reach mutual understandings. If I put on my Singaporean hat from the medical school there, transiently I'd say, gee, you guys have developed the doses for drugs, for example, based on Caucasians with some African-American input, but we probably need different doses among Asian people, and we don't really know. So a lot of work to do there. Y'all need to move on, Bill. I think It's been a pretty long list of questions. I wasn't expecting quite so many, but thank you, and I look forward to hearing this next session.